"Give me the keys, Miss Fell. The muniment room is closed to you." Gideon Marlowe held out his gloved hand in the stone passage of Fenbourne Hall, while 2 footmen watched, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Prynne, smiled at the floor. Honora Fell stood very still in her black mourning dress, her father's iron key ring heavy in her fist. Her father had carried those keys for 40 years. He had been in his grave for 11 weeks. "There is a lawsuit coming, Miss Marlowe," she said. "The answer to it is behind that door, and I am the only person left in this house who can read it." The steward's silver-side whiskers did not so much as stir. "A lawsuit is a matter for gentlemen, Miss Fell, not for an archivist's orphan who has outstayed her welcome. The keys, and you will oblige me by leaving the estate cottage before Friday." She laid the ring in his palm 1 key at a time, and she did not weep, and she did not argue, and there was a stillness in her that should have warned him. It did not. Gideon Marlowe could not know that before the summer was out, he would carry those same keys back across the crowded great hall, in front of Sir Gervas Loxwood and 2 of the sharpest lawyers in England, and set them in her ink-stained hands and bow. He could not know that 600 acres, 11,000 pounds, and the honor of a dukedom would come to rest on a single sheet of vellum that only this dismissed young woman would ever have found, or that the proudest men in 3 counties would stand in perfect silence to hear her read it aloud. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. To understand what those keys unlocked, you must go back past the funeral, past the winter, to the house itself. Fenbourne Hall rode above the river levels of the West Country like a ship at anchor, grey stone and mullioned glass, a hammer-beamed great hall hung with 8 generations of dukes in oils, drawing rooms of crystal chandeliers, polished walnut, and towering arrangements of hothouse lilies. A dining table that seated 40 beneath silver-gilt candelabra. But the oldest room in the house was not grand at all. At the top of a turning stair, behind a door of black oak studded with iron, lay the muniment tower, a vaulted octagon lined from flagstones to ceiling with deed boxes, court rolls, rent books, letters patent, and grants going back to the days when land was still spoken for in Latin and in the old French of the law courts. 300 boxes, 5 centuries of the estate's memory, and for 40 years 1 man had kept it. Aldous Fell had come to Fenbourne as a young clerk and never left. His wife died when their daughter was small, and so Honora was raised at the top of that stair, among the smells of dust and beeswax and old sheepskin, learning her letters from the margins of a psalter, while other children learned theirs from a slate. She was allowed 1 candle after supper, and she spent it on the rolls. At 14, she traced a missing lease that settled a tenant's quarrel, and her father let the steward's office take the credit, and told her that a keeper of records serves the truth and not the applause. By 20, she could date a deed by its handwriting alone. Her father taught her Latin, and then he taught her the rarer thing, the law French of the medieval courts, a tongue that was neither the French of Paris nor the English of the fields, but the language in which English land had been granted, sued for, and defended for 300 years, and which almost no one living could still read. The old duke used to climb the stair on winter evenings to hear Aldous talk, and he would find the archivist's daughter perched on a ladder with a court roll open across her knees, and he would say that Fenbourne kept 2 treasuries, and only one of them held silver. Then the old duke died, and 18 months later, in January, Aldous Fell followed him. He had insisted on finishing the winter inventory in the unheated tower, took a chill into his chest, and was gone in 11 days. Half the village stood at the graveside in the January mud, and the vicar spoke of a faithful servant, and Mr. Marlowe sent a wreath that was correct to the shilling. On the last evening, when the doctor had stopped pretending, he pressed a green shagreen notebook into his daughter's hands, his private key to the collection, 40 years of knowledge set down in his own crabbed contractions. His last clear words were not about heaven and not about her. He said, "If the river is ever questioned, Nora, the abbot's gift." The new duke buried the archivist with honor and did not know what he had lost. Alaric, 9th Duke of Fenbourne, was 31 years old and had spent 10 of those years away, first at sea and then in London, so that the house he inherited was a house he barely knew. Society called him proud. The servants called him distant. The truth was simpler and lonelier. He had come home to ledgers he did not trust, tenants whose names he was still learning, and a steward who managed everything, including, very nearly, the Duke himself. Gideon Marlowe had served the estate for 30 years and was respected in 3 counties. He was exact, tireless, and honest to the farthing, and his fault was not greed. His fault was certainty. He was certain that the muniment tower was 300 boxes of lumber, certain that Old Fell had been an indulgence of the old duke's, and certain that the daughter was a charity that had outlived its object. In the first week of March, a letter arrived from the solicitors of Sir Gervase Loxwood of Loxwood Park, and the quiet of Fenbourne ended. Sir Gervase laid claim to the Millbrook Meadows, 600 acres of the richest grazing on the levels, the low green country between the river and the ridge that brought the estate £900 a year in rents and hay. His proofs were an enclosure award map drawn in 1794, and an attested copy of a deed made in 1712. And his lawyers observed, with velvet politeness, that the original grant on which Fenbourne's title rested had never once been produced in any court. The Duke's solicitors, Tolliver and Grace of Lincoln's Inn, wrote plainly, "If the original could not be found, the copy would govern, and the copy favored Loxwood. To lose would cost the Meadows, and with them the costs of the suit, upward of £11,000 all told, and lawsuits over land, once lost, have a habit of breeding. Nor was it only rent. The Meadows wintered every beast on the estate, and the Gurneys of the Millbrook Dairy, who had milked that grass for 4 generations, stood to lose their living with it, and 7 other tenant families behind them. A boundary, in that country, was not a line on paper. It was bred. Marlowe's answer was to hire an expert. Mr. Everard Fanshawe came down from London with beautiful whiskers and a more beautiful opinion of himself, an antiquary who had catalogued a Marcus's library, published 3 papers in the reviews, and never in his life been told he was wrong. He dined with the Duke on his first evening, clear soup, turbot, a saddle of mutton, and a burgundy the old Duke had laid down before anyone at that table was born. And he talked brilliantly of manuscripts he had known as other men talk of horses. The Duke listened with perfect courtesy and went up to bed unable to say whether he had hired a scholar or an actor. He took rooms in the East Wing, demanded a fire, a desk, and silence, and boxed the ears of the hall boy who dared to carry one of the deed boxes under one arm instead of 2. In the housekeeper's room, over Mrs. Prynne's tea tray, the silver pot and the seed cake and the good china, Marlowe explained the household's position with the calm of a man arranging furniture. "The girl is a charity that has outlived its object," he said. "Her father was a servant who read old paper. She is a servant's daughter who imagines old paper made her a scholar. Mr. Fanshawe is a gentleman of reputation. He will find whatever there is to be found." Mrs. Prynne poured, and agreed, and the matter was considered settled. That was the week the keys were taken. The house had one summer to find a grant 5 centuries old, and it had just locked out the only person alive who could read it. Honora took one room in the village, under the roof of Widow Hesketh, the sexton's widow, at $1 a week. She earned the shilling copying parish registers for the vicar, a gentle old man who paid her in coin and kindness and pretended not to notice that she copied twice as fast as he could check. She did not speak of the hall. But the hall came to her, in the person of Dorcas, the youngest housemaid, a freckled, breathless girl who had loved old Fell because he had once set her broken finger and told no one she had broken it on a forbidden banister. If Mrs. Prynne had learned where her half-days went, Dorcas would have lost her place without a character. She came anyway, every week, down the back lane with candle ends, half a loaf, and news. The news was all of Mr. Fanshawe. Mr. Fanshawe had catalogued 100 boxes and understood perhaps 30 of them. Mr. Fanshawe had labeled the coronation roll a bill of sale. Mr. Fanshawe had sent to London for a book on medieval abbreviations which he kept hidden under other papers. And Mr. Fanshawe had declared whole shelves illegible waste and ordered them set aside for clearing. And so, in the second week of May, Honora put on her gray dress, took up her father's desk ledger, which was estate property and had to be returned, and walked up the long lime avenue to the hall to deliver it, and to see what could be seen. A footman left her waiting in the servants' passage on the bench beside the steward's room, and the steward's room door was not quite shut. She did not intend to listen. Then she heard the word charter, and after that she did not move. "There is no charter, Marlowe." Fanshawe's voice was rich as gravy. "There is a family legend of a charter. Every old house has one, like a ghost, and it is worth exactly as much. I have been through the Tower. Latin grants, court rolls, rubbish, advise His Grace to settle while Loxwood will still leave him his costs. And when the room is cleared, sell me the waste parchment at 6 pence the pound. No one alive can read it, so it is worth precisely its weight." There was a pause, and the small ring of a decanter against a glass. "His Grace will sign what I lay before him," Marlowe said. "He signs everything I lay before him." Honora set the ledger on the bench and walked out past the kitchens with her face perfectly composed, and anyone watching would have seen a shabby young woman in gray, and no one watching would have known that the estate's last defense had just decided to fight. That night, by 2 of Dorcas's candle ends, she wrote a memorial to the Duke. 9 pages in the fine clerk's hand her father had drilled into her. The history of the Millbrook Meadows, how they had come to the family from the Abbey at the dissolution, and how the Abbey had held them under a royal grant of King Edward III, and how somewhere in that descent there had been a charter that fixed the boundary in words, the charter her father had called the abbot's gift, and had spent his last years hunting through 5 centuries of boxes. She sealed it, directed it to His Grace in her plainest hand, and gave a carrier's boy 2 pence to deliver it. 4 days later it came back down the lane unopened, with one line across the wrapper in the steward's exact script. His Grace does not correspond with dismissed servants' daughters. What she did with that letter was set it in the shagreen notebook, flat and square, the way her father had pressed flowers, and in the evenings, locked out of the Tower, she began to rebuild it on paper. From the shagreen notebook and from a lifetime of memory she wrote out, press by press, what stood behind that black oak door, 300 boxes reconstructed at a farm table by the one person forbidden to touch them, until the widow's kitchen wall was papered with a room she could no longer enter. Somewhere in that room was the abbot's gift. Her father had believed it to his last breath, and among all his exact and patient entries there was a single one she could not solve. 2 words of monk's Latin set against the name. Ubi cantabant, where they sang. And no shelf in her memory sang. What she did next was go to the meadows themselves. May had come in wet, and the levels were half silver, the river fat against its banks, and at first light the mist lay on the water like combed wool. She went out along the causeway with a board, paper, and a pencil, and she began to draw what the old deeds described. Because a boundary is not only words, it is stones and weirs and channels, and stones outlive clerks. She was kneeling in the wet grass beside a leaning block of granite, old past all memory, when she heard hooves on the causeway and a voice behind her, dry and level. "You are trespassing, madam." She did not turn at once. She finished the line she was drawing. "So is Sir Gervas, sir," she said, "and I am at least doing it with a pencil." The rider was a tall man on a horse worth more than the vicarage, hatless, plainly dressed, with the gray light on a face that gave away nothing. He looked at the drawing board, at the granite block, at the composed young woman soaked to the knee in his meadow. "What is it you are drawing?" "The gray mare." She laid her hand flat on the stone. "That is her name, sir, in every deed this valley ever swore by. La Gris Jument. The weir below the mill is the fulling weir, because the abbey fulled its wool cloth there. That silted channel behind you was the water itself, 500 years ago. Sir Gervas's map says this land lies on his side of the river. The river never moved, sir, only the words moved, when lazy men copied them." He was quiet for a moment. Somewhere out on the levels a curlew called. "Who taught you to read a field like a deed?" "My father. He kept the muniment room at Fenbourne for 40 years, and he is dead. And I am told the lawsuit is a matter for gentlemen." "And if the matter were yours to argue?" he asked. "Then I would find the abbot's gift, sir. My father staked his last winter on it, and I do not intend to let a clerk who has been dust since Queen Anne take 600 acres from the living." She gathered her papers and stood, and dropped him a curtsy exactly as deep as a stranger's do, and no deeper. "Good morning, your grace," and she walked away up the causeway, leaving the 9th Duke of Fenbourne sitting his horse in his own flooded meadow, outread, outmannered, and entirely unable to account for why the ruin of his morning felt like the first honest conversation he had had since he came home. He rode out again at first light the next morning, and told himself it was to look at the fences, and the meadow was empty, and he was surprised how much the emptiness displeased him. She had known him at a glance, of course. She had grown up beneath 8 generations of that family's portraits. He had her face by heart before he learned her name, and her name, when he asked his steward that evening, arrived wrapped in careful pity. "Fell's daughter, your grace." Grief takes some women that way. She has been writing letters, I am sorry to say. It is kindest not to encourage it. June brought the hearing date, the last week of July at the summer assizes in Gloucester, and it brought Mr. Fanshay's written opinion, delivered in the library among the globes and the gilt spines with the confidence of a sermon. No original charter existed. The family tradition of the abbot's gift was, in his professional judgment, a legend. His grace would be wise to settle. Sir Gervas, sensing the wind, grew generous in the manner of victors, and his keepers began walking the meadows as if they already owned the aftergrass. And one gray morning they turned the dairy herd off the levels and penned it against the ridge, where the grass was thin and the milk fell away to nothing, and the gurneys stood in the lane and watched 4 generations of their living chew furs, and the village talked of nothing else for a week. And then Marlowe, tidying the world he was certain of, did the one thing that could not be undone. He ordered the tower reduced to order, and the shelves that Fanshawe had condemned were carried down the turning stair in 2 wicker hampers and sold as waste parchment to Prowse the glover of Stourbridge, at 6 the pound, to be cut for glove linings. Dorcas saw the hampers go on to the carrier's cart at 7 in the morning. By 8 she had run the back lane, and by 9 Honora was at the hall steps in her gray dress, bareheaded, asking, in front of the assembled morning staff, that the hampers be recalled at the estate's own cost. Mrs. Prynne looked at the gravel and smiled her downward smile. The footman looked at the sky, and Mr. Fanshawe, filling the doorway with his watch chain, looked at the archivist's daughter and laughed out loud. "Madam," he said, "if you can read the law French of the 14th century, then I am the Archbishop of Canterbury." The laughter went round the steps the way laughter does when wages depend on it. Honora let it settle. "Then pray, your Grace of Canterbury," she said, "that the glover is slow with his shears." And she turned and walked back down the avenue, 9 miles to Stourbridge, on foot, with everything she owned in the world knotted into a handkerchief. £3 and 11 shillings, the whole of what the parish registers had paid her since February, and her father's silver watch in case it was not enough. It was high June, and the road ran white with dust, and she counted the milestones all 9 miles, and a carter's wife gave her a lift for the last 2 of them and would take nothing for it. Prowse the glover was a big, slow, careful man with a shop that smelled of alum and new leather. He listened to her with his hands flat on the counter. Then he waved away the watch, took the £3 for what he had paid and the carrier's fee, and carried the hampers to the door himself. "I've a daughter, miss," was all he said. "Take your paper." It took a farm cart and the last of her shillings to bring the hampers down the valley, and it took 3 nights at Widow Hesketh's kitchen table, by tallow light, to sort them. Court rolls chewed by mice, a bailiff's account of the year of the great frost, letters about wool, wool, and wool again. Widow Hesketh kept the fire in and the kettle on, and asked no questions, which is its own kind of love. And then, near the bottom of the second hamper, wrapped in a torn altar cloth, a thick quarto bound in oak boards and worn calf, and her hands knew it before her eyes did. The cartulary of Millbrook Abbey, the register into which the monks had copied their charters, bound up in the boards of a psalter after the abbey fell. And with her hands flat on the worn boards, the 2 words that had defeated her for weeks opened like a lock. Ubi cantabant, where they sang. A psalter is a singing book. Her father had not been raving in his last hour. He had been telling her the shelf. She went through the binding with a lamp at her elbow and a knife from the widow's drawer, and under the calf of the spine, sewn flat against the boards with linen thread gone brown, lay a folded sheet of vellum, and from its lower edge, on a plaited silk cord, hung a seal of green wax. She read the first line and had to set it down and walk once around the kitchen before her hands would hold still. A charter of the Chancery of King Edward III, given in the 25th year of his reign, confirming to the abbot and convent of Millbrook their meadows by the river, with the boundary written out in the old French, word by word, stone by stone. Pinned through one corner was a paper slip in a hurried 17th century hand. Hid from the sequestrators of the Parliament. God restore his majesty. Some archivist in the wars had sewn the abbey's best proof into a psalter to keep it from the Parliament men, and had died before the king came back, and the hiding had outlived every man who knew of it. 2 nights later, at 10 o'clock, in the rain, someone knocked at Widow Hesketh's door. and it was the Duke. He had gone to London that week to instruct Tolliver and Grace to settle, and old Tolliver, folding his spectacles, had asked one question. Had the abbot's gift ever been run to ground? Fell had written of it for years, the old man said, and Fell was not a man who chased legends. The Duke had demanded every letter, and among them found reference to a memorial, 9 pages, sent to the hall in May, and back at Fenbourne that evening he had asked his steward for it, and watched the first crack run through 30 years of certainty. "You returned it unopened," the Duke said. "I did not think it worth your Grace's time," said Marlowe. "You have made a great many decisions about my time. The girl is grieving, your Grace. It is kindness not to encourage her. You have told me twice now what is kind, Marlowe. I begin to wonder what is true." Now he stood dripping in a farm kitchen, hat in hand, while the sexton's widow gaped from the stairs, and on the scrubbed deal table between the teacups lay a sheet of vellum with a green seal, and the Duke of Fenbourne looked at it and could not read one word. Honora turned the lamp up. "Then I will read it to you," she said. And in that low room, in a voice level as water, she read out a dead language as if the clerk had set it down that morning. And the Duke stood in his wet coat and listened to 600 acres come home. He came back the next night, and the night after with Tolliver's junior taking notes, while she made the fair translation and set out the proofs in order, and Widow Hesketh, scandalized into hospitality, fed the Duke of Fenbourne dripping toast at her own hearth. He watched her fingers move down the lines without one hesitation. He said very little, but on the third night, standing at the door with the rain stopped and the lane smelling of elderflower, he turned. "My house has been better served from this kitchen," he said, "than from my own steward's room." Then he asked her, abruptly, what she meant to do when the suit was over, and she looked at the vellum lying between the teacups. "Finish my father's catalogue. Someone must." He had no answer to give her, and he rode home the long way, along the causeway, past the gray mare standing black against the stars. 2 weeks before the assizes, the Duke summoned a conference at Fenbourne Hall, and Sir Gervase Loxwood came expecting a surrender. The great hall was set out like a courtroom that had married a banquet. The long oak table, dressed in green baize, inkstands and sand casters at every place, cold fowl and hawk on the sideboard, and the 8 generations looking down from their frames. Sir Gervase sat with his counsel, Mr. Harkness, Queen's counsel, a spare grey man with a mind like a razor strop. Tolliver and Grace sat for the estate. Fanshawe arranged his papers with the flourish of a conjurer. Marlowe stood at the Duke's shoulder, where he had stood for 30 years. And along the walls, because the Duke had given no order to clear the hall, the household lingered over errands that did not exist, for the servants always know when history is coming to dinner. Fanshawe performed first, and it was, in its way, magnificent. The tower catalogued, the tradition weighed, the legend regretfully dismissed. No original charter existed, and gentlemen do not go to law with legends. Marlowe stood expressionless through all of it, and if a doubt had opened in him by then, he kept it from the room. Then Harkness set out his client's terms with terrible courtesy. The meadows to Loxwood, each side to bear its own costs, generous terms, all things considered. Open until the quarter struck. The clock on the gallery gave them its slow tick, and Sir Gervase studied the Duke with the mild pity owed to a young man about to lose his finest ground. The Duke let the silence sit. Then he stood. "Before I sign away 600 acres my family has moaned since the reign of the 3rd King Edward," he said, "the House will hear one more witness." He nodded to the doors, and the doors opened, and the whisper ran along the walls before she had crossed the threshold. Fell's daughter. The archivist's girl. Her that walked to Stourbridge and bought the parchment back. Honora Fell walked the length of the great hall of Fenbourne in her plain dove-grey dress, carrying a black deed box, with every eye upon her and her chin perfectly level. Mrs. Prynne stopped smiling at Floors. Fanshide's neck went the color of the hawk. Sir Gervase turned to the Duke with his eyebrows up. "Is his Grace's case to be argued by a housemaid?" "By an archivist," said the Duke. She set the box on the green baize, and out of it, in order, she laid 3 things. The attested copy of 1712 in Lockswood's own bundle, which she requested and received with a bow from a bewildered Harkness. The cartulary of Millbrook Abbey, oak boards and worn calf, which she opened to the copied grant, and then unfolded from its wrappings with both hands, the vellum itself, the green seal turning on its silk cord, 5 centuries old and clean as the day the wax was pressed. "A charter of the Chancery of King Edward III," she said, "given in the 25th year of his reign, confirming to the abbot and convent of Millbrook their meadows by the river. The boundary is written out in the French of the law courts. I will read it, and then I will translate it." And she did, slow and level, the dead syllables filling the hammer-beamed roof where they had not been spoken aloud in 500 years, "De la ware de Follin chesque à la gris chemin outre lewe," and then in English, from the Fulling Weir up the old channel to the grey mare beyond the water, together with the eel fishery and all the meadow lying between. She let the words stand a moment. Then she set her finger on Lockswood's copy. Now the copy of 1712, gentlemen. The clerk copied the same boundary, and he dropped 3 words. Outre lewe, beyond the water. Strike those 3 words, and the boundary walks backward from the far bank to the near one, and 600 acres cross the river on a clerk's slip. Sir Gervase's whole claim is a copying error, and here is the sentence it was copied from. Harkness was out of his chair before she finished, glass in hand, bent over the vellum like a man at prayer. He examined the seal, the silk, the hand, the endorsements on the back, and he checked the charter against the cartulary, and the cartulary against the copy, and no one in the hall so much as coughed. Then he straightened and asked her, as one craftsman to another, where the instrument had lain for 2 centuries that no search had ever turned it up, and she told him. The Psalter binding, the linen thread gone brown, the sequestrators of the Parliament. She handed him the pinned slip in its hurried 17th century hand, and Mr. Harkness, Queen's Counsel, read it and nodded slowly, twice, which those who knew him said was as near to applause as he had come in a lifetime at the bar. It was Fonchevais who broke first, and to his one credit that day, he broke honestly. He looked a long time, and when he straightened up his flourish was gone. The hand is a chancery hand of the 14th century, he said. The seal is sound. The cartulary confirms it word for word. I stated that no such charter existed. I was wrong, Your Grace. This document is genuine, and it is fatal to the claim. Harkness set down his glass and turned, not to the Duke, but to his own client. Sir Gervase, I have stood up in court against many things in 30 years of practice. I will not stand up against the original grant. If you proceed, you will lose, and you will pay handsomely for the privilege. I advise you to withdraw tonight. Sir Gervase Lockswood sat quite still, a heavy man deflating slowly, 2 years and a small fortune settling on his shoulders. Then he rose, and being a gentleman under the vanity, he bowed first to the Duke, and then, deliberately, to the young woman in gray. Madam, my grandfather enclosed by that map in good faith, and I have spent 2 years and a small fortune defending a dead clerk's carelessness. I withdraw." And then came the sound of slow footsteps on stone, and the hall turned, and Gideon Marlowe walked the full length of it with the iron key ring in his 2 hands, the same passage of flagstones down which he had once sent her packing, past the footman who had watched him do it. He stopped before her, and the man was gray to the lips, but he did not spare himself. "I have kept this house's accounts for 30 years, he said, "and I nearly signed away its finest acres because I would not open one door. I could not have found this in 100 years, nor read it if I had. I was wrong about you, Miss Fell." He laid the keys in her ink-stained hands, and he bowed. She did not smile. She did not accuse. She looked down at the worn iron her father had carried, and when she spoke it was to the whole listening hall. "My father used to say that a great house does not stand on stone. It stands on what it remembers." And the Dowager Duchess, who had sat unnoticed by the fire all afternoon and missed nothing, rose, crossed the hall in front of counsel, steward, and neighbor, and kissed the archivist's daughter on the cheek. And nobody along those walls pretended to be on an errand any more. The end of the suit was a formality and a sensation in the same week. At Gloucester the claim was withdrawn before it was called, with costs against Sir Gervas, and the judge, who had looked forward all circuit to a famous land case, was heard to say at dinner that the only pleading worth hearing that summer had been delivered in a private hall by a lady. The county papers, which had been sharpening their pens for a duke's humbling, printed instead the story of the maid, who was no maid at all, but the finest reader of old law in the west of England, and the seal of King Edward that had slept inside a psalter through wars and kings and clerks. Sir Gervas paid every shilling of the costs, sent his keepers to take down the new fences with their own hands, and never again disputed so much as a hazel hedge along that river. The dairy herd came back down to the levels the same week, and the Gurneys mowed the aftergrass in September under a mild sky, and at the church door on the Sunday following, the old vicar said nothing about any of it, and shook Honora's hand for a very long time. Mr. Fanshawe went back to London a quieter man, and the paper he published that winter on the Fenbourne Charter named Miss Honora Fell in its first sentence, and he never again valued a document by its weight. As for Gideon Marlowe, his letter of resignation lay on the Duke's desk the morning after the conference, and the Duke, who had been up half the night deciding, was minded to accept it. It was Honora who asked him not to. "He kept your farms honestly for 30 years, your grace," she said. "Let the punishment fit the fault. He locked one door. Keep him from mine." So the steward kept the farms and lost the tower forever, and served on exactly and honestly, and when he retired at last to the North Lodge, every Michaelmas after, a box of the year's estate papers arrived at the tower, docketed in his own precise hand, with never one word of instruction attached, which was from that man a whole apology renewed annually. Honora Fell was appointed archivist of Fenbourne at £90 a year, her father's place on terms she dictated herself. The tower was refitted with new oak presses, proper lamps, and a small iron stove set into the old flue, because no keeper of that room would ever again take a January chill among the boxes for want of a fire. Above the door, on a plain brass plate, the Duke had them letter the name of Aldous Fell. Dorcas came up from the housemaid's corridor to be trained as her assistant, and learned to read first the new hands and then the old ones. And the first thing she ever read out loud without help was her own name in the wages book, whereupon she burst into tears and had to be given the afternoon. And the charter itself went into a case of glass and brass in the center of the room, where the Duke came to look at it rather often. He came, in fact, all autumn. His Grace developed a scholarly interest in his own archive that no one who knew him could account for, and the household, which knows everything first, began leaving the second lamp trimmed. The dowager said nothing, and smiled at her needlework. In October she sent for Honora to pour her tea, examined her without mercy over the rim of the cup for the better part of an hour, and at the end of it said only this: that the old Duke had been right, and the house had always kept 2 treasuries. That the men of this family, when their moment came, proposed with paper, for his own father had courted her with the deed of a rose garden, and that she was on no account to laugh at her son when it happened. In November he arrived up the turning stair with a folded draft and asked, with great gravity, for her professional opinion of a settlement his lawyers had engrossed. She read 3 lines and stopped. It was a marriage settlement, and the bride's name, written out fair in the clerk's best round hand, was her own. She sat very still, one finger resting on the vellum, and he stood by the stove and made no speech at all, having planned several and abandoned every one of them on the stairs. "You have put my name into a deed, Your Grace," she said at last. "It was the only language," he said, "I was certain you would trust." She took up her pen and dated it in the old style, as the abbey clerks had dated their grants, and signed. He took her hand and kissed it, and neither of them made a speech, and the little stove ticked in the quiet, and it was enough. They were married in the estate church in the spring, and the altar was dressed not with hothouse lilies, but with meadowsweet cut from the Millbrook levels, and Prowse the glover sent up from Stourbridge a pair of white kid gloves with a note that said only, "From the man who nearly lined gloves with your wedding portion." The village stood 10 deep along the churchyard wall. The Gurneys brought their best beasts garlanded to the lane gate, and Widow Hesketh wore a bonnet that was discussed for a decade. Dorcas cried through the whole service and denied it afterward to anyone who asked, and when the new Duchess of Fenbourne walked out into the sunlight, she carried no bouquet, only her mother-of-pearl prayer book and, on a ribbon at her waist, 1 worn iron key, the oldest of them all, the key her father had carried for 40 years. For rank can be inherited, and fortune can be argued, but the soul of a great house is kept, not owned, and it gives itself at last to the hands that kept it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal drama. Tell us in the comments what should have answered the steward's resignation, dismissal for the door he locked, or the mercy Honora chose for him. And let us know where you are watching from and what time you finished this story. And join us next time for the story of a governess turned away from a great house at dusk, and the secret in her traveling trunk that would bring its master to her door by morning. At Fenbourne, the lamps along the front of the house went out one by one, and high in the old tower a single window stayed golden into the small hours, where 2 heads bent close together over a page 5 centuries old, reading.